so I'd like to call on Chris to...
Thank you very much, Kim. It's my privilege this morning to introduce to you Dr. Gilles Patry. And to set the stage for that, I'd like you to consider the question, what is the prime ingredient in technological innovation? Now, according to James Dunderstad, President Emeritus of the University of Michigan and author of the book, Engineering in a Changing World, it's leadership. It's leadership in engineering research, in engineering education, and leadership in the engineering profession itself. Knowledge is a supreme commodity. Whether we succeed or fail will be determined by our ability to deal with the technical and social dimensions of innovation. In other words, it's all about what we know and how we apply it. Now, in his address this morning, Dr. Gilles Patry, a professor and President Emeritus of the University of Ottawa, will examine the challenges and opportunities that are facing Canada's engineers, in particular, the need to actively engage in the shaping of public policy. Engineering, academia, and the business world have benefited substantially from Dr. Patry's contributions. He was President and Vice Chancellor of the University of Ottawa from 2001 through to 2008, after serving first as Dean of the Faculty of Engineering and then Vice President Academic. In addition to a 10-year civil engineering professorship at McMaster University and a 5-year teaching post at École Polytechnique in Montreal, Dr. Patry was a water resources and environmental engineering consultant. Hydromantis Incorporated, the Hamilton-based consulting firm which he founded, is a Canadian success story and now operates around the globe. Now, among his many career accomplishments, Dr. Patry directed more than $300 million of capital investments at the University of Ottawa, including the School of Information Technology and Engineering and the Biosciences Complex. As well, he led the University of Ottawa's second fundraising campaign, raising a record $226 million, substantially above target and 1 year ahead of schedule. Dr. Patry is a prolific author, having produced more than 200 papers, technical reports, and other publications. And not only quantity, he's known for quality. For in 2006, Water Research, the leading water research journal, named his paper on dynamic modeling one of the 10 most significant papers in the journal's 40-year history. His contributions have been recognized with several honors. For instance, he was elected a Fellow of the Canadian Academy of Engineering, awarded a Queen Elizabeth II Golden Jubilee Medal in 2002, and named Executive of the Year by Regroupement des Gens d'Affaires of the National Capital Region in 2004. Dr. Patry earned a Bachelor and a Master of Science degree from the University of Ottawa, a PhD in Civil Engineering from the University of California at Davis. Please join me today in welcoming Dr. Gilles Patry.
Thank you very much, Chris, for this very generous and kind introduction. I want to start by congratulating PEO on the creation of the Ontario Centre for Engineering and Public Policy. It is high time for the profession to take a leadership role in engineering and public policy, and I really applaud this initiative. I've decided to title my presentation, Innovation, the Engineering Profession, and Engineering Education. And what I'm going to try to do in the next little while is try to address, first of all, the Canadian Innovation Challenge, and then bring this into the engineering profession and engineering education. So I'll try to be a little bit provocative for the engineers in the room that are practicing engineers, and for the academics that are leading our institutions. So Chris mentioned James Dunderstad, and this talk is influenced extensively by the work of James Dunderstad, who was a former dean of the Faculty of Engineering at the University of Michigan, but also past president of the university. And he said, as was mentioned, that preeminence in technological innovation requires leadership in research, in education, and in the profession. And we'll try to address all three in the 35 minutes that I have with you today. And as is mentioned, in a global knowledge-driven economy, our success or failure will be measured by how well or how poorly we do with respect to the innovation agenda. And engineers are key players in this agenda. First of all, I'll try to address the Canadian Innovation Challenge. And I'll try also to be a little bit provocative, and it's unfortunate that there are not too many politicians in the room. The Council of Canadian Academies defines innovation as a new or better way of doing valued things. Innovation is not limited to products, but includes improved processes like assembly lines and new business models like web-based commerce, for example. An invention is not necessarily innovation, and it only becomes an innovation until when it has been implemented to a meaningful extent. And innovation is the process by which individuals, companies, and organizations develop, master, and use new products, design, processes, and business methods. And the components of innovations include research and development, invention, capital investment, and training and development. And this is coming from STIC, the Science and Technology Innovation Council, that provides advice to the Prime Minister, essentially, on issues of innovation and science and technology. And innovation can be transformative and result in the development of entirely new markets, or they can be incremental. And you might ask, why is innovation important? Well, innovation will drive productivity, it will improve income, and it will give us a higher standard of living. And in driving that economy, essentially, we are improving the lifestyle of Canadians. To date, we've been fortunate in Canada to benefit from a dominant natural resources economy. But that is not the answer in the future. In fact, we have failed to innovate in the natural sector economy also. If you just have a look at our pulp and paper industry, most of the machinery that is used in the pulp and paper industry is not manufactured, not even designed in Canada, but in Europe. And so we've not been very innovative because of our dominance on the natural resources economy. We have been fortunate to rub shoulders with, up to now, the dominant world economy, but for how long? So various agencies in Canada have produced reports over the years to try to address the challenges that Canada has in terms of the innovation agenda and the Canadian innovation ecosystem. So on your left, you've got the Conference Board report. In the middle, you'll have the Council of Canadian Academies report in 2008. In the third, or the blue report, is the State of the Nation in 2008, produced by STIC, the Science and Technology Innovation Council. And also the Government of Canada, Industry Canada, produced its latest report, Competing to Win. And all of these talk about the need to develop an innovation agenda in Canada. And the drivers of innovation are, I've identified 4 drivers here: a private sector that has science, technology, and innovation strategies at its core, institutions of education and research that develop, recruit, and retain strong talent pools, and researchers who keep at the forefront of knowledge, and workers who see and act on opportunities to work smarter and more creatively. Just this week, in the Ottawa Citizen, there was a piece by John Morrissey referring to the presentation that Craig Alexander, Toronto Dominion's chief economist, on the need for Canadian companies to innovate. And the title was "Innovate or Perish, Canadian Firms Warned." And he says in there, and these are quotes, you only need to observe the number of engineers graduating every year in Asia for a sign of things to come. The bottom line is that Canadian firms must innovate or perish. From the Second World War to the early 70s, productivity grew in Canada by more than 4%. It grew by only 1.6% in the past decade and slipped to a shockingly low 0.7%. In fact, what's more important is our expenditures, our gross expenditures on research and development in Canada. I've plotted here the expenditures as a percentage of GDP going from 2.1% in 2001 down to 1.9% in 2006 and slipping further very likely in 2007, 2008, and as I'll explain in a second. And this compares to expenditures of well above 3% in the Scandinavian countries and in Europe. And I'll give you an example that in Israel, just the civilian R&D expenditures are in the neighborhood of 4.8%. And if you added the military expenditures, you'd be at 8.5% of expenditures on research and development. And so this is a warning sign for Canada on the need to invest in R&D. When you look at the breakdown of these expenditures, I've listed here the business expenditures in research and development. There are essentially three components to expenditures: the business expenditures, the higher education expenditures, and the government expenditures on research and development. And you'll see that Canada does not do very well in terms of the OECD countries, ranking in the last quartile in the upper left-hand graph. And the trends in business expenditures in research and development are pretty catastrophic when you compare yourself to the US, which is the blue line on the right graph, and the average of the OECD countries. And if we want to compete in a global economy, we have to address that challenge. In fact, the Canadian innovation gap, when the conference board looked at what we were doing, and when the government of Canada in its Compete to Win document looked at what we were doing, they said that we ranked poorly across almost all aspects of innovation in Canada: the creation of knowledge, the dissemination of knowledge, and the transformation of knowledge, and the use of knowledge through commercialization. While Canada has one of the highest rates of completion amongst its peer groups for college education, college and university education, few graduates, few Canadians go to graduate school and engage in master's and PhD. And I'll show this in a second. And we even have fewer graduates in the business sector, so the entrepreneurial component is also lagging. And few domestic students are interested in graduate studies. Just have a look at our faculties of engineering at the master's and PhD level. And so we need to make sure that we encourage more Canadian students to engage and increase our numbers at the graduate level, PhD level. So this is a graph coming from the Conference Board of Canada, a recent report, on the number of PhD graduates per 100,000 population, aged 25 to 29 on this graph. And you see that Canada ranks last in the numbers of graduates at 209 graduates in 2007 per 100,000 population in that age group. And you see that the US ranks at 289, but if you go to Europe, the UK is at 448, Finland above 600, and Sweden above 700. So there's a challenge here, but also, as was mentioned by Minister Bentley, there's an opportunity for us to address that challenge and convince our elected officials of the need to invest in that sector if we are to address the Canadian innovation gap. Here's another number, and Ontario does not fare very well even compared to the Canadian average and to our neighbor to the east, Quebec. The left-hand graph is the number of masters produced in 2007. This age group now is 25 to 34, so the numbers are slightly different. But where you'll have for Canada, 7.87 graduates per 100,000 in that age group, 9.6 in Quebec, and in Ontario, 7.6. So we're almost 20% lower than our neighbor to the east. At the PhD level, we do a little bit better than the Canadian average, but not, we still lag the number of PhD produced in Quebec. So we need to address that challenge, and that's part of the innovation challenge, as was mentioned by James Duderstadt, also by the studies that were mentioned. So let me go back to Duderstadt's report, the Millennium Project, and he identifies that the emergence of a global knowledge-driven economy based upon technological innovation is likely to demand, and I would say demands, a profound transformation of engineering practice, engineering research, and engineering education. And for those of you that are in the engineering practice, this means you in terms of addressing that change. Engineering practice and technology needs are changing the nature that we practice engineering, demanding far broader skills than simply mastering scientific and technological needs. And so, in his book, or in his report, he identifies the offshoring of engineering jobs. And if you speak to leaders in some of our dominant industries, for example, IBM will, in Canada, will offshore a lot of its engineering development simply because of brighter and better and cheaper individuals around the world. The decline of students interested in science and engineering. This is a phenomenon not only in the US, as we've heard, but also in Canada. The decline of the participation of women in engineering, and I'll come back to that in a second. The decline in the number of domestic students graduating from our engineering faculties. And more importantly for me, the lack of visibility of the profession compared to other professions like law and medicine, and I'll come back to that in a second. And the virtual absence of engineers in the public policy debates, and this is why the Ontario Centre for Engineering and Public Policy is such an important contribution to Ontario and to Canada. And also, this raises serious questions about the adequacy of our approach to engineering, the profession, but also the engineering education. And let me address the engineering profession. You know, one of the things that I've been saying repeatedly in the last couple of years is that it's been said that engineering in this country is the invisible profession. We're all converted. I mean, we are engineers and we know the value of engineering. But most Canadians only have a vague idea of what we do. And as a result, our national consciousness is not aware of the roles that we play in medical research, in alleviating human suffering, in creating such devices either as the BlackBerry or the iPod. And I could name 30 other inventions or devices where engineers have been instrumental and led in the development of these products. So there is a problem of leadership in the profession in that sense. Some have argued that engineering has become a second-tiered profession. It might be hard for to say at a PEO's conference, but compare this to the MDs and the LLBs, the lawyers. We had Minister Bentley here a second ago. When I was president of the University of Ottawa, I never quibbled when a lawyer would come at the university and we had an issue with either human resources issues or whatever, identifying an hourly rate of $500–600 an hour. And you know, this, we never quibbled about paying a lawyer $500 an hour. But yet, I would venture that those that are involved in engineering practice on a daily basis, you'll have to negotiate downwards your fees with the municipalities or with other agencies, even at $175 an hour, going down to $150 an hour for some of your senior engineers. You know, and this is a quote that I've taken from Stephen Mraz. You know, engineers in the early days of the space agency race used to tell the story that when a rocket launched successfully, it was called a scientific breakthrough. But when it exploded on the pad, or shortly thereafter, it was called an engineering failure. And so we have a bit of work to do. I mean, we can tap ourselves on the back, but I think there is we have some convincing to do and some public policy, some communications issue, and one of the challenges that engineers have is communicating more effectively. And so this brings me to engineers and public policy. Why is it that engineers are virtually absent from key public policy decisions involving scientific and engineering issues, whether it's energy, telecommunications, health, the environment, and water? Well, let me give you an example. This book was produced very recently. It's called O Canada. It's a study of the management and use of water across Canada, water supply, water quality, water commerce, watershed management, wastewater treatment, and water rights. A very, an excellent book. As you've heard, I'm in the water area, and this is essentially an excellent contribution. But there is not a single engineer in the 27 contributors that have contributed to this book. So if we don't get involved in the debates in shaping public policies, we risk that they will be set by individuals who know nothing about the engineering issues. And so that's critical. So we don't have any right to complain. I used to say when I was president of the university, when somebody was absent, they had no right to complain. Well, if we're absent from the debate, we have no right to complain. We need to get engaged, otherwise the issues and the policies are going to be set by those that do not know about necessarily as well as you do about the topic. So engineers and public policy, in terms of engagement, the engagement of engineers in shaping public policy have been virtually non-existent, but we should not be surprised because engineers have not been trained to address those issues. We very rarely, up until now, have incorporated this into our curriculum, or in your case, in your practice, to get involved, to allow your junior engineers or intermediate engineers or senior engineers to get involved in the public policy debate. I understand that you've got to generate some billing hours, and when I was in practice, I had the same challenges. But if we are not part of the debate, then we have no right to complain. So it is critical that we get involved in the development of public policies to ensure that public policies are based on sound engineering and scientific concepts. And at the same time, this will allow us to translate complex engineering concepts into publicly accessible discourse, because that's one of our challenges also. And so Duderstadt, I'm coming back to him, stated on the status of the profession that it is essential to elevate the status of the engineering profession, providing it with prestige and influence to play the role it must in an increasingly technology-driven world while creating sufficiently flexible and satisfying career paths to attract a diverse population of outstanding students. And of particular interest is greatly enhance the role of engineers both in influencing policy and popular perceptions and as participants in the leadership in governments and businesses. But there's hope. These observations should not be surprising, as I said. Public policy issues have traditionally been addressed by the faculties of social sciences, and engineers, as I said, have not been trained. However, the creation of the Ontario Centre for Engineering and Public Policy is a step in that direction, and the launched in 2006 at my former school, the Graduate School of Engineering Practice, that Andy had the pleasure of directing for several years as the founding director of the Dofasco Centre for Engineering and Public Policy. So I guess we are getting there, but we're getting there slowly, and it's going to take a little bit of time and engagement on the part of all of us. But leadership in the engineering profession also involves leadership in engineering education. You know, there's been several studies on the challenges that we have in the engineering education domain. And I'm going to be advocating for not a narrowing down and a specialization of engineering education, but much more for a liberalization of engineering education. And I know engineers have said, and CEAB, the accreditation board, says that they're involved in multidisciplinary education and so on and so forth. I would argue that this is essentially just lip service. We have not been serious about addressing the issue of liberalizing our curriculum as much as we should have. Here are a number of studies that all are advocating for an increased liberalization of our engineering curriculum. And in the document itself, when you click on either one of these reports, you'll get access to the full report or to where you can purchase the book that is referred here. And so I'll be addressing some of these, not one by one, but a few of these documents as I go along. The first one is Educating Engineers, Designing for the Future of the Field by Sherry Shepard of Stanford. And this was part of the Carnegie Foundation for the Professions Project. And they looked at several professions. They looked at doctors, engineers, lawyers, nurses, clergy, and teaching. And they chose these professions on the basis of 6 characteristics. Number 1, service to others. Number 2, theoretical body of knowledge, that the profession had to have a theoretical body of knowledge. Number 3, that there was a domain of practice. Then that there was judgment to be applied, experience, and then professional community involvement. And so these were all multidisciplinary studies that were undertaken. And what's interesting about all of these reports, and this is only one, is that the members of the reports overlapped one another. So you had an MD sitting on the engineering report, a clergy sitting on the nursing report, etc. So you had a flavor of the cross-disciplinary professional involvement. One of the things that she said is, or that they said, because it's a multi-author report, although engineering education is strong on imparting some kinds of knowledge, it is not very effective in preparing students to integrate their knowledge, skills, identity as developing professional. One of the things that they advocated is that they said that we should align engineering education to engineering practice. Engineering should be taught as a profession and not as a collection of technological subjects. And that is a challenge. And it is imperative for teaching, the imperative for teaching for professional practice. Duderstadt, and I'm coming back to him, said that it's important to broaden the educational experience of engineering students. And I would argue, and if when you read down this list, I would argue that we need to eventually change the entry to practice from the baccalaureate level to the master's level. In many cases it's done. In my field, in water, essentially you virtually have to have a master's degree to practice as an environmental engineer or water resources engineer. But I would argue that we need to move, that maybe one solution is to move in that direction. If we are to liberalize a little bit more the undergraduate program and then focus the specialization later on in our development of the curriculum. And in one of the things that all of the authors that I've indicated a second ago agree on is that there is a strong consensus that engineers of the 21st century must be broad thinkers who appreciate the global and societal implications of engineering and value the critical links between technology and society. And in 2001, the 2020 Engineering Forum held in Ontario concluded that engineers had to acquire these skills, leading to social, global, and political awareness, and to ethical decision-making. And it called for a more flexible definition of engineering by promoting interdisciplinarity and a balance between technical and artistic training, and more emphasis on teamwork and communication skills. And again, I'll refer back to my years at McMaster when we introduced in the mid-90s the Engineering Society program, which was a 5-year program where students would do their chemical engineering program, but at the same time specialized in theater, for example, or in political science, adding to the broadness of training that the engineers were receiving. One of the things that, if we are to take a leadership role in engineering education, we need to support and value teaching. This is always easier said than done, particularly for a former dean of engineering and a past president, because we get accused of focusing solely on research. Research is important, but after all, the reason that we are in a university environment is to train students. And obviously the vast majority of these students are undergraduate students, so we should pay a lot more attention and value teaching a lot more. And secondly, the universities should take a leadership role in working together to develop state-of-the-art multimedia, self-paced pedagogical material. Dr. Beeman made reference to this in his remarks, and Andy is going to remember that when I was at McMaster in the mid-80s, in 1985, we introduced the Mac-Eng Micro program, which was essentially providing a student with a computer. At that time, 1985, many of you were not even born, and providing them access to a computer with the software at that time. I had the impression at that time, in 1985, that in 5 years down the road, or at maximum 10 years down the road, we would have adapted our teaching. We would have adapted our learning methods, our teaching methods to the learning abilities of the students. And, we're still talking today about developing technological material for technological or pedagogical material using technology. Several universities, as you know, have put their courses on the web. I would invite you, there MIT that's done this. I would invite you to go to the Berkeley website. I have nothing against Cal. It's a good competitor to UC Davis. But go to the Berkeley site and have a look at some of the chemistry courses there. You'll be very surprised at and they're all videotaped. And so you can download them. You'll have the 30 lectures, 31-hour lectures, given by very prominent chemists, for example. And I would argue that the way that the courses are being taught in 2007, the ones that I've looked at, it's exactly the same way that I was taught chemistry in 1966, 1967, from a pedagogical perspective, from a learning perspective. And so I would argue that we have evolved very little, if not at all, in using technology to address one of the challenges that Clayton Christensen has identified, the various learning methods that students need in trying to learn a topic, learn a subject. And so this book by Clayton Christensen, The Disrupting Class, identifies, I think, 7 ways of learning, whether it's the theoretical concept, the practical concept, etc., and advocates that we need, as educators, to adapt our methods of teaching to these various ways of learning. And technology is very well suited for that type of approach. And so, again, that's a challenge for the community. Finally, what I would like to do is to argue for a restructuring of the engineering program. I think we're at a stage right now where we need to address that issue. Should engineering be a second entry program, just like law and medicine is in Ontario? That was the case in Quebec up to 1966, believe it or not. Everybody in Quebec that went to engineering had to go through what we call a liberal arts program. And only after that did they go to either medicine, clergy, or engineering or law. And so, essentially we're reinventing the wheel But I would argue that we need to focus a lot more on that aspect of our teaching, which is essentially look at restructuring our program and potentially going to a 5-year program. If we don't make it a second entry program, looking at making it a 2+3 or extending it to a 5-year, like McMaster has done for some of their programs, and or a 6-year program. Now, this brings me to the last topic that I want to address, and it's attracting more women in engineering. And I would argue that if we were to liberalize our curriculum, if we were to incorporate these changes, that this would enable the engineering education to respond to another key challenge, which is the continuing underrepresentation of women in our programs. You know, universities in Canada and abroad are still continue to face a serious underrepresentation. We went from a little over 22, 23% in the late 90s, early 2000, and we've been slipping ever since. If you look at this graph, and I just pulled the latest data in 2008 from Engineers Canada, and while the number has gone up ever so slightly to 9,745 in 2008 in terms of the number of women, we still are going down to a dramatically low number of 17% or slightly less than 17% this year. So several factors can be used to explain this decline, including an overly rigid and prescriptive curriculum, and the enduring image that engineering is a male-dominated profession, and also women's attraction to the life sciences. Obviously, if we look at some of the engineering programs that have a life science component to them, we see a larger representation of women in those programs. However, there's ample evidence that a more creative and socially relevant curriculum tends to bring and retain more women into our engineering studies. And there's strong presence of women engineers in fields of environmental engineering and biomedical engineering, as we all know. Let me conclude by coming back all around in terms of innovation, profession, and education. We need to address the shortfall in research and innovation in Canada. We need to focus on the training of graduate students, and we need to have receptor capacities within your firms, within the engineering firms, to bring in some of the creative people, some of the people that have masters and PhDs, so that we move the innovation agenda more effectively in Canada and invest more into that aspect. We then need leadership in engineering education. There's a need to incorporate, I believe, a strong liberal arts component, and maybe relook at the way that we are teaching engineering. And also, I think there is a responsibility on the engineering profession. Engineers need to take leadership role in the community and in shaping public policy. And if we want to cast away this cloak of invisibility, as I said, we need to get the word out about the work that we do. And so increasingly, employers are looking for engineers who are what they call entrepreneurial integrators, and that is creative people who bring together pieces of various disciplines to make things happen. Thank you very much.
I'd like to call on Chris to thank our speaker, please.
Well, I'd like to start off by saying how much I appreciated your talk. The part you finished off talking about what makes an engineer and how we're perceived by society and our education. It reminds me of that Dilbert comic. This is Dilbert Day, I guess, here today, where the scene is a mother at the doctor's office, and she's getting some bad news. And the doctor tells her, I'm afraid your son has the knack. It's a rare condition characterized by an extreme intuition about all things mechanical and electrical, combined with utter social ineptitude. He'll be an engineer. Now, seriously, though, what I see your speech as is and your talk today is certainly a wake-up call for us to take action. And I'm sorry that our friend Attorney General Bentley had left because it's a message I really like the politicians to hear. And the one part of his discussion this morning where he was talking about the pyramids and how people appreciate looking out at the great achievements over time of the engineering profession, and he was kind of longing for being able to look out there and say, look at all the great lawyering that's taken place. When you were discussing what is innovation, and your quote was, a new and better way of doing valued things. I think that that's the answer to his question, valued things, the difference between the lawyering and the engineering. So I think that what we need to do is to convince our elected officials of those valued things that we do. And we also need to present them with some of the solutions. They have people knocking on their door all the time telling them of all the problems that we're facing. But we're the solutions people, and I think that we can come to government with some of those solutions. And nobody's going to do this for us. It's up to us. We, as you said, we have no right to complain if we don't become actively engaged. So I take your presentation today as somewhat as a call to action, and it's one that I hope that everybody here heeds and moves forward with. And I'd like to thank you very much for that call.
Thank you very much, Chris. Great presentation. One of the things that I think that we really need to figure out along the whole lines we're talking about is that how do we actually create a program where we own the podium with an innovation strategy? And I think that how do we get government to come on side with that? And we had an interesting, at the Alberta conference in there that was a roundtable hosted by Alberta's President Kim Farwell. She did a great job on putting together. And one of the things that came out of that conversation, and I know that Engineers Canada President Dan Batika is looking at how do we get the Canadian Leadership Forum engaged in exactly doing that. So very good message. Thank you very much. We're at break time. You've got choice of one of three sessions. There's the one session. One of the sessions, the policy session is in here. The water resource section is in the Governor General Suite on the second floor, just kind of right at the top of the stairs. And the third session, the nanotechnology session, is just kind of diagonally across that session. We'll have a 20-minute coffee break, and you make your way to the sessions. And then at noon, you come back to the room that's just right directly behind us for lunch. And if everybody can stay on time to 12 o'clock back for lunch, that'd be very much appreciated. So thank you very much, and we'll see you at lunch.